Well, although it's already 11:35, we are not really behind schedule because Ms. Nefedova unfortunately is ill and will not be able to be with us today. So we got a few minutes of leeway, and I would nevertheless try to use this time for a more intense discussion than we were able to have in the previous session. And even though we have one presentation less, I would like to ask the presenters to stick to the timetable in order to allow a bit more of discussion. And the first of the presenters today is Ms. Valentina Cillo from the Polytechnic University of the Marche in Italy, and she will tell us about innovating through digital revolution, focusing on the role of soft skills in firm performance. Ms. Cillo, the floor is yours.
Okay. Okay, good morning. Thank you, everybody. Thanks to the university for the kind invitation. This presentation will focus about innovation through digital revolution. Yesterday and also the first day we spoke about a lot about the fourth industrial revolution. But the focus of this presentation is on soft skills. And this presentation has its roots in a recent scientific research we conducted in collaboration with the Zhejiang University of Technology in China. Even if the final sample sites of the research include around 300 cases for the analysis, we collaborate with the university, this China University, for the strong impact of the industrial revolution on the factories in that countries, and also for the emerging role of blue-collar workers in that countries. As you know, the fourth industrial revolution literature, management literature, focus indeed on knowledge workers, but in this research we focus mostly on blue-collar workers. Blue-collar workers are very important in the fourth industrial revolution, but there is a lack of knowledge about the role of blue-collar workers. In this picture, we can find summarizing some of the information we analyzed the previous days, and the very interesting information that we can focus on is the transition from the 4.0 economy to the 5.0 economy. We spoke about the last days in the previous days about the integration of technology and the digitalization, impact of the digitalization on enterprises, and we see that the focus of the 4.0 economy is on introduction of connected devices, data analytics, and obviously artificial intelligence technologies to automate processes further. So the focus is on data-driven innovation and automation. But another factor of this phase is the customization of production, and the customization of production is conducted to the personalization of economy. So the fifth industrial revolution will focus on the cooperation between man and machine, and the human intelligence we will work in harmony with the cognitive computing. So the challenge for the future is to integrate better the technology with the human and organization. This is the reason why the main perspective, the perspective of this research is a managerial perspective of course. So the main aim is to understand better how to help companies to manage human people, organization, and tools in companies. This is the main perspective of this research. I introduce the research with a very famous quote from Warren Bennis. Warren Bennis is a very important scholar. He worked a lot with also Drucker. He's one of the father of the management. And this is a very nice quote that very often in the talk people used to introduce the fourth industrial revolution. The quotes say basically that the factory of the future will have only two employees, a man and a dog. Yesterday we also talked about dog. And the man will be there to feed the dog, and the dog will be there to keep the man from touching the kitten. It's a very nice, fun quote, but I think that it's not the reality, because it's the reality if we don't understand better how to integrate technology and organization and people. This is a reason why we focus on blue-collar workers, because one of the main challenges of the future in the main framework of fourth industrial revolution is the skill shortage, and also the importance to save the work of blue-collar workers, because we know that knowledge workers has a specific knowledge, and it's very difficult to replace knowledge workers with machines. But blue-collar workers have a specific job that robotics, for example, could replace. So it's very important to understand better how to evaluate and also give a value to blue-collar workers. In this pitch, in this slide, we can see another very famous information from World Economic Forum about the next skills, the skills of the future. And we can see on the right that we have some growing skills and also some declining skills. But we will focus just on the growing skills, and we can see that we have all analytical, creativity, critical thinking. These skills are all related to the to soft skills. And on the left, in this slide, we can see that we have an emerging role of higher cognitive and social emotional skills. And we can see that from the sides of the bubble that social and emotional and higher cognitive skills are the most important soft skills that workers should adopt in order to cope the challenge of fourth industrial revolution. But as I said, the most part of the literature, the scientific literature, management literature, is on knowledge workers. The role of blue-collar workers is there is a lack of knowledge about this. So jumping to the research of to an overview of our research, we can see that the purpose of the research is to contribute to the understanding of the relationship between employees' knowledge and organizational performance. And the originality of the research is the focus on the personality and interpersonal attributes of workforce blue-collar workers and how they can affect business performance in highly innovative contexts. So basically, the focus of our research is intangible resources management. As we know, the intangible resource management is assuming a strategic role in digital innovation framework. And is an important field of research. In order to conduct our research, we adopt a structural equation model because, as we can see on the next slides, we have a specific research design, so we employ this kind of method. And with regard to the findings, the result of the analysis indicate a positive relationship between workers' commitment to develop their soft skills and their career success. But very interesting, we found a role, a strategic role of soft skills between knowledge management and organizational performance. With regard to very summarizing the theoretical framework, we have two main fields of research, and the originality of our work is that we merge two different theoretical framework. The first framework is the knowledge management framework. We focus on internal and external dimension knowledge management, and the second one is human management framework. In the last scientific work, management scientific work, there are a lot of works in knowledge management and internal external dimension of knowledge human resource management. Why? Yes, we spoke about artificial intelligence and machine learning, for example. So the human dimension, if we speak about intellectual capital, so we can speak about the human dimension, the structural dimension, the social dimension. We are speaking about the human dimension. So it's very important to merge the organizational perspective with the human perspective. So we basically focus on organizational learning, combination of explorative and exploitative structures, and on the other side we focus on soft skills and career success and development. At the center of this slide, you can find the research design that we adopt. We basically analyze the relationship between knowledge management capabilities and career success, and we analyze specifically the relationship between explorative capacities and career success, transformative capacities and career success, and exploitative capacity and career success. Obviously, knowledge management has the roots on three main sections, on three main subfields, people, technology, and process. And the greatest challenge in this moment is to understand better how to integrate data management, information management, and knowledge management, because we are in this moment in a data-driven economy, but we have to give a significance to this data. Because it's very important that our management tools focus on impact instead on input and output. So our focus will be on people and the impact that management have on people inside and outside the organization. With regard to the explorative capacity, generally literature describe the explorative capacity as the capacity of managers of connect with external environment and to explore new knowledge and new innovation. So it's the precondition of innovation, no? And is one of the most important activity in open innovation framework, explorative capacity. Transformative capacity regards the capacity of a manager and the company of retain this knowledge, to retain and adapt this knowledge to the specific characteristics of the company. And exploitative capacities means that the company has the ability to use this new knowledge to improve innovativeness in the company. How exploiting means that the company had the capability to transform this knowledge in new products and in new services. But in our research design, we conduct this research, we found a direct relationship between explorative capacity and exploitative capacity with the career success, but we found an indirect relationship between transformative capacity and career success. And we found that in this relationship, a strategic role, we can attribute a strategic role to soft skills. With regard to the career success, we adopt two different perspectives. And objective career success and subjective success. And with regard to the variable and items, we can see that with regard to career success, we analyze the salary level, the promotion, the career satisfaction. With regard to soft skills, we analyze motivation, commitment, level, reliability. And with regard to knowledge management capabilities, we analyze, of course, as I say, explorative capacity, transformative capacity, and exploitative capacity. Here in this room, we have one of the most important scholar in the field of knowledge management, Professor Del Giudice and Professor Messner. So we share also before some information, a lot of information about this specific field of research. We have basically 4 hypotheses, and the hypotheses were tested with the structural equation modeling, and the results are reported in this table. Shortly, with regard to the results, there is a positive relationship between the blue-collar workers' approach to soft skills towards motivation, commitment, and reliability and their career success. And this finding is very important because it's very confirmed the previous study about soft skills. And it's very important because confirmed that adequate levels of soft skills are considered very desirable for moving forward in their career, in the career of blue-collar workers. Second, there is a positive relationship between organizations' approach to knowledge exploration and blue-collar workers' career success. So, what it means that the greater effort in exploration of new knowledge of the company, the greater success of blue career workers. So there is a direct and close relation between the 2 dimensions. The third result shows that there is a positive relationship between company approach to knowledge exploitation and the employee career success. So is similar to the previous results. So in this case, the focus is on innovation activity, exploitation, innovation activity of company. And the fourth result found that there is a positive relationship between companies' approach to knowledge transformation and career success, but mediated by employee soft skills towards motivation, commitment, and reliability. And it's very interesting because with this last result, we know that investing in motivation, commitment, and reliability of blue-collar workers, we can also improve the capacity of a company to retain the knowledge. So it's not enough that the company explore the new knowledge from outside. It's very important that the knowledge acquire the capacity to retain this information. Otherwise, we don't have better innovation performance in terms of better product, better service, and also in terms of intellectual property also. So there are several practical implications, but I want to focus, since I have just 5 minutes, on future research. We have several future research streams that we can launch from this research. The first one is that our research open new opportunities to study the impact of soft skills on the concept of learning organization as a construct based on the combination of knowledge, organization, and people and technology. And it's very important, this study, to highlight that we had to invest, we have to analyze better the role of learning-oriented culture. So because there is a close relationship between the learning-oriented culture of the company and the innovativeness of the company. The second one is a very hot topic in Europe, for example, because we know that intangible asset, there is a closer relationship between intangible assets investment and productivity of the company. For example, I come from Italy, and Italy has not a good ranking with regard to this relationship. Our company invests a lot of money in tangible assets, in new machine, in new factories, but we don't have investment in intangible assets. And if you look at the European database, we can see that Italy has not good performance with regard to productivity, and there is a closely relationship between intangible assets investment and productivity of the country. So there is, and this is another very important future research stream. The last research stream regards the public policies, because we can suggest to politicians that in order to improve employability of some specific category, social category, we are speaking about blue-collar workers, and to improve social integration, we have to invest in this kind of activity. We have to improve soft skills, not just for knowledge workers, but also for workers. And obviously, the last point is immediately connected with the future of the education, no? How we can develop the education in the future. If we speak about education 4.0, we can see that it's very important in the future to customize education. Another fun picture we can see in this slide is very famous about education system. And this quote say that everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that this is stupid. So we have to customize our education, and we have to invest on customization of education in a long life perspective. And so the drivers of education 4.0 will be the future skills, so soft skills is one of these, and millennial mindset. With regard to the customization, we have to consider obviously the millennial mindset, and also a collaborative platform. That is the collaborative platform have an emerging role in the education 4.0. So we have to invest better in the alignment of industry requirements with education. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions of clarification? Because otherwise I would take the questions in the end of the session. If this is not the case, then I pass on to yet another Valentina, Miss.
This?
No.
Oh, sorry, okay.
Miss Valentina Polyakova from ISSEK, who will talk about a recent population survey which shed some light on, are people in Russia ready to live and work with robots? Ms. Polyakova, the floor is yours.
It's okay. It's okay? Thank you. I would like to present some results of our previous research of public attitudes to robots. And first of all, I would like to describe the structure of my presentation. Before I will describe the research context, then I describe methodology, and finally I will present some results related to attitudes to interaction with robots and perception of risks related to robotization. First of all, we decided to choose public attitudes to robots as some indicator of innovation attitude of population, because the actual situation on technology market, all we know that the global robot and artificial intelligence market is growing, and it is expected that it will grow in the future. There are some factors that stimulate further development of robotization, and they are linked not only with some manufacturing needs, like the aim to minimize production and labor costs, but also there are some social triggers. First of all, robotization can reduce some danger where humans have to work now, and robotization can help in the future in terms of the aging of population worldwide. So, of course, there are some risks and benefits of robotization, but the objective of further research is to find the way how to balance them. Now, the robotics in Russia is quite low, and several years ago, approximately 2 years ago, Russian government has launched a specialized program, and it is expected that governmental support will stimulate development of robotization and automation in Russia. So our survey aimed to provide some details on public attitudes and public demand on robots. To study public perception of robots, we choose the concept of trust because the trust it is a basis of any interaction, not even human-human, but also robot-human interaction. So we can reformulate our main question: are people ready to live and work with robots in Russia? In the question, are people trust to robots, and do they ready to rely on robots? So to answer this question, we will consider following aspects, like what roles of robots are more accepted among population, what are main stereotypes about robots, and what people think about effectiveness of robots in comparison with human. We use the findings of representative survey of population aged from 11 to 65. Wait, I'm sorry. Yeah, we wanted to ask youngest audience, but then we decided to level up. The fieldwork was almost a year ago, but the findings and the database we received several months ago. So now I will consider in more details our results. So we see that perception of robots demonstrate the same ambivalence as any science and technology perception among people. So, on the one hand, people think that robot and artificial intelligence is a good thing for society, and on the other hand, they expect some risks. And I think that robot may endanger human security. And this perception of robot influences on perception and attitudes to interaction with robots. So we see that the most accepted roles of robots for Russian population is technical role, when a robot assists at home, deliver some goods, and provide some legal advice. I have to clarify that the third variant means that robot doesn't take any decision. He just provides some recommendation, or he can clarify some legal question. When a person have to understand what robot do, or to interact with robot as a human being, such situation considers as uncomfortable. People doesn't want that robot decide something, and they don't ready to independent activity of robots. So the last accepted roles of robots are fields out of personal control, like driving a car, when a passenger can't control the process, the care for humans, elderly people. In our question, it was parents, and especially child. And people are not ready to use of surgery robotics. At the same time, we compared results in Russia with statistics in Europe, and you can see that such problematic and contradictional situations of use of robots are more accepted in Europe. So we suppose that it linked with the rate of robotization, because the density of robotics in Europe is much more higher than in Russia. And in this case, people probably aware more about robots. What about impact on labor market? We see the same ambivalence. On the one hand, robots can do hard and dangerous job instead of people, and on the other hand, people have some fears because some current profession may disappear because of robots, and robots can replace people in most jobs. At the same time, the share of people who consider that robots can replace them is fewer. We see that people are a little bit skeptical about the effectiveness of robots because most of our respondents consider that robots can do their duties only partly or are not able to do their job at all. At the same time, every second believe that some parts of his or her job can be automated. It is interesting that people who believe in robots and think that they can replace them are ready to interact with them. So the difference is about twice. Around 60% of employees who think that their current job could be done by a robot, at least partly, feel comfortable to work with robots. And among skeptics, the share is only 30%. At the same time, the perspective of robotization put the problem of involvement of people in further education, because now the most vulnerable category of employees are out of any additional learning activities and some professional and amateur courses. So in the future, government should develop some infrastructure and opportunities to include these categories in educational practices. So the soul our results, and to conclude, I would like to provide some remarks, summary remarks. Based on surveys in Russia, we suppose that for countries with low density of robots, it is typical public acceptance of service and professional robots in technical and assistance role, and low level of trust in robots. And robotization of care of human medicine and transportation of people requires changes in public attitudes and public awareness of robots. And finally, the further development of robotics should be accompanied by the development of opportunities for lifelong learning of adult population. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Again, if there is a need for a clarifying question, I would take it now. You have been pretty clear, it seems. So we go. Oh, there is one. Sorry.
Just clarifying in your fourth or fifth slide, you mentioned that you made some 7,000 interviews in 1 month.
Yeah.
How many people were you to make so many face-to-face interviews?
It is the regular monitoring survey in our institute, and
But you also said it's face-to-face interviews.
yeah.
But these were not 7,500 face-to-face interviews, were they?
At home. At home of
Okay.
correspondence, yeah.
It is. It's part of a national statistical collection.
Okay, okay, thank you. Thank you very much for clarification. And I pass on immediately to Jonathan Linton from Sheffield University, but most of you know him for also being very much affiliated with ISSEK and HSE. Jonathan.
Okay, thank you very much. Very nice to be with you all this morning. I'm going to talk about something a little bit different, which is more on the relevance to foresight. Well, it does have a relevance to policy, but I'd say it's got a strong relevance to foresight also, which is understanding the different impacts of innovation across the supply chain. So here I'm going to think about innovation from the perspective of the supply chain, not from an individual user or from a firm, and it's often looked at from the perspective of the firm. If you look at it from the perspective of the supply chain, things look very different, and that's very important from a foresight standpoint. It also does have some strong policy implications. The critical issue is that when we adopt an innovation into a firm or into a part of a process of making a product, be it a component or part of the processes that are used to transform materials and components into a product, that it doesn't only involve a single party, the end user or a company that's somewhere on the supply chain, but it impacts the entire supply chain that it sits within. And this is a critical thing to think about in terms of STI policy when one is looking at what sort of thing one is going to be in or what is not. So, for example, sometimes a country will look at something and say, we feel we need to be more in aerospace, and they'll aim at aerospace as an entire supply chain. But realistically, it could be that the selection of specific innovations which can be integrated and will need to be integrated into existing supply chains may be a much better play. Similarly with foresight, when we're looking at foresight and roadmaps, we're looking at what's going to happen in the future. And there's this question, of course, that these new technologies will come in, but who will develop them? If we're developing them, will our champions be able to integrate into the existing supply chains in other countries, in our own country? If we're not developing them, will our supply chains be able to receive them? Because if they're not able to receive them, then what it may end up is that you end up moving out of an entire sector or industry because your end product becomes obsolete and you have to rely on imports after that. So, having talked a bit about what I'm going to talk about, I'll actually talk about it. So innovations are often described in different ways. There are four ways that I'm going to touch on quite quickly here. Continuous versus discontinuous. If it's continuous, it means that the party involved doesn't need to do anything to adopt the innovation. It's kind of invisible to them. If it's discontinuous, they need to clearly change their behavior. So I have a smartphone here. If I want to make a phone call with the smartphone, it's quite continuous when you take into consideration the older phones. However, once upon a time ago, I visited Futuropolis in Singapore, and I tried to play a little game where I would concentrate and make a little car go around a circle. I was trying to race against a colleague, and I found that this discontinuous skill was quite difficult to pick up at first. All right, so continuous versus discontinuous. Then we have product versus process. Are we looking at changing a process? Are we looking at making a product? And the product might be an end product, or it might be an intermediate, which is integrated into an existing product to improve it in some way. Then we have the idea of an incremental change versus a radical change, and there's been big debates. back from the 1980s forward about what is better off and what are the differences between firms and between cultures that are good at incremental versus radical, and arguments could be made in either's favor. And then more in the late 90s and early 2000s, we see a lot of talk about disruptive innovation versus evolutionary. The talk about evolutionary dates back a long time ago. The pickup of disruptive innovation has been much more recent, and there are arguments in favor of both. So all of these different ways of describing innovation, when we talk about them, are typically from the perspective of a user or an individual firm. And what's critical to picture, though, is that it is a little bit different with a supply chain. Now, the first important thing is for the end user to enthusiastically adopt something, innovations need to be continuous. So I have a smartphone. I'm doing this sort of social thing and showing how nice my little smartphone is. It's continuous in terms of use as a telephone. It's discontinuous in terms of all sorts of other functions, all the different applications, but it's very easy for me to decide whether I'm going to try and take advantage or not take advantage of that discontinuity. If we look at an innovation which is discontinuous, for example, the setup of the old typewriters and our keyboards now are based on an inefficient system for typing, which was adopted originally because the efficient system for typing would allow you to type too quickly and the mechanical components would get jammed. None of us should be using this old inefficient system for typing. We should now be using the efficient system for typing, but that would be discontinuous for everybody who's already typing. So although it makes much more sense to do so, very few people have done that. So really critical. End user enthusiastically adopt innovations are continuous. When we have discontinuous innovations, we see lots of failure. All right. And that could be failure of a firm when there's something that's disruptive that occurs, or even a radical innovation which makes things discontinuous, and the firm may not be able to adopt that. And that's really important when we think about things from the perspective of the supply chain. And we also think about an organization within the supply chain, a supply chain partner. If they're dealing with something that's discontinuous, they want to try and make it seem as continuous as possible downstream, so that they're greeted as a partner and not as a menace. Okay, so I wanted to sort of make that a little bit more emphasized. Okay. However, innovation at some point in the supply chain will always be discontinuous. So if we're looking at innovation, it's going to be discontinuous for somebody. Somebody is going to need to make changes. All right. And it may be that nobody's making changes in effect because you're looking at a new entrant, and the new entrant is dealing with the innovation, and that is natural for them. Or it may be that an existing party, as a result of road mapping, or as a result of trying to catch up to the first movers in the field, are trying to change. So if we're looking at discontinuous, there are questions. How much value is added immediately? A lot of value has to be added for an organization or an individual to deal with discontinuity. 10% improvement, not enough. Doubling, maybe enough. Order of magnitude, probably enough. And that value could be on different dimensions. It's not necessarily on the dimension of cost or profit. What are the physical limits? So what is that innovation potentially going to offer? So why do we see people moving decades ago from vacuum tubes to transistors? The physical limits on the transistors were tremendous compared to those on the vacuum tubes. And on certain dimensions, on reliability, it added tremendous value immediately. What combination of desirable characteristics are offered? Really, really important to understand, because very often a discontinuity is offering certain characteristics that not everybody is looking for, but some users will find very, very valuable. And I'll touch on an example of that in a little bit. And does it alleviate any problems currently being faced by the supply chain? When it comes to adopting new things, very often we're much more interested in risk reduction than we are in value creation. Then some additional questions. Are we looking at the supply chain ejecting a current member? Are we looking at integrating a new member into the supply chain? Are there barriers that exist for ejection or integration? And how capable is a new partner of integrating into the supply chain? So, promised a few cases. I've been waving around a cell phone a bit. In addition to the smartphone, I'm going to suggest sensors or actuators based on semiconductor manufacturing techniques. So instead of making something electronic, making something that senses, or making something that does something physical as opposed to electronic, and then eventually quantum computing. So here we have a smartphone. I thought I'd show a flexible smartphone because it's a bit more interesting than my smartphone. And with the smartphone, what we see for the user is it's continuous because we can use it as a telephone, and the way we use it as a telephone is the way we use the older cell phones, the flip phones, the old large mobile phones, which probably none of us ever used, the old landline phones, which had numeric keys. And if you have if you had the old dial phone where you had the round circular thing, fortunately, it's not so difficult to change from that to the selecting of keys. So for the user, the smartphone is continuous. For the telephone functions, it's discontinuous for additional things which can be ignored or can be used. For the supply chain, certain parts of the supply chain found this to be very discontinuous, and a lot of them no longer exist. The suppliers for the organization that dealt with the discontinuity were typically new entrants, in many cases, into the field, and then a downstream from the organization that dealt with all of these discontinuities, be it Apple or some Huawei or some other smartphone producer. You have a distribution channel which basically just did the same thing that they always did, and then the user, who, as I said once before, is doing things the same as they always did. So you have a point of discontinuity in the supply chain with the smartphone, with potentially a completely new set of organizations upstream or before that discontinuity, and continuity downstream or beyond that as you get closer to the customer. Now, here is a sophisticated example of a MEMS device. One of the ways you know it's a sophisticated example is you see that little symbol. Oh, you can't, it doesn't really show up on the screen there. At the top corner there, that's the Sandia National Labs symbol. Sandia makes some very sophisticated microsensors. Now, MEMS or these microsensors or microsystems, or micro electromechanical systems, what the MEMS stands for, when they first came out as sensors, they came out with a simple pressure sensor. People were experimenting with what to do with old semiconductor equipment, which was just not good enough anymore. And what they did was they found that they could make things like pressure sensors with this old obsolete equipment. The pressure sensors were much smaller, much lighter, but much more expensive than electromechanical sensors. The companies found that one of the things they needed to do was they needed to make the interface the same as a traditional electromechanical sensor, although it was much smaller. And this was helpful in making it continuous for everybody downstream. What they needed to do, though, was find an industry that found this exceptionally attractive. And the industry that they found that liked this was aerospace. Because if you want to put something up into orbit and it costs $10,000 per kilo to launch something into orbit, making something, a sensor, a pressure sensor, microscopic's very helpful. It's also helpful for commercial aviation, but the savings are much smaller. So that order of magnitude improvement in terms of size and weight that was available allowed this to get into the industry, allowed for testing, and then allowed for other applications, more sophisticated and in different sectors. For example, in our cell phones, we have these, we have roll sensors in cars, we have them in game machines. And then finally, we have quantum computing. And with quantum computing, we're looking at a completely different underlying technology than the computing that we're now using. And we're looking at an increase of speed of about 10,000 times over what is currently possible. So we're looking currently at 5 orders of magnitude, and that the theoretical possibilities with it are even higher. So we've got a tremendous opportunity for speed. So in applications where we're looking at very large amounts of data, we could potentially go into doing analysis that we couldn't do in the past. We could also be looking at moving things into real-time analysis, which we couldn't do in the past. So what are the implications to Foresight road mapping? A supply chain partner can reduce the likelihood of disintegration or being kicked out of the supply chain through both technological and non-technological means. Continuity is critical for integrating innovation into supply chain. So if you're looking at bringing something in, the question is, how do you make sure that it is continuous for other parties? You can't say, well, this is much better, you just need to change the way you do things. You say, this is much better, and you don't need to change the way you do anything. And in fact, a large part of the supply chain may not realize that anything has happened. Ability for an organization to integrate into a supply chain is critical. Organizations got a new technology. If they're not good at integrating into supply chains, then they will fail. A similar sort of failure that we see to technological entrepreneurial startups about, it's not only about the technology, it's about the management, important to understand that. Management and the systems, I should say. The capability of supply chains to disintegrate and reintegrate is variable and needs to be considered. So if you have a supply chain, you're part of a supply chain, and the supply chain can't basically kick somebody out and bring somebody new in, then you could be a very strong competitive firm, but be out of business because your supply chain can't change at the right places at the right time. So that takes me to the end. I believe that means the end, and they all lived happily ever after in Russian. And I think I'm more or less on time. And I hand things back over to Wolfgang. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all the speakers for being more or less on time, which leaves us with a few minutes of discussions, and I take questions. Yeah, we can start the discussion among the panelists. Valentina, you have a question or a comment?
Yes, I have 3 questions. No, very shortly. Thank you for your presentation, Jonathan. I have a lot of ideas about supply chain innovation, and I'm interested in your opinion, which is your opinion about 3 three issues. The first issue is the relationship between internationalization strategies of company and the supply chain integration. You spoke about supply chain integration, so we know, according to the studies about the user design experience and users, you spoke about end users, that integration of customers and stakeholders is very important to adapt the company strategy to the context, the specific local context. So, what is your opinion about this? So, the relationship between internationalization strategy, supply chain integration. The second one is probably a question about conceptual bias that there is in continuous innovation, because what is the difference between continuous innovation and planned obsolescence today? No, because we spoke about a smartphone, but we know that every innovation but smartphone is planned. So is a strategy of the company to put on the market several kind of models in several times. So probably there is a conceptual bias between continuous innovation and planned obsolescence. So it is just an issue to cope, to analyze better these two different concepts. And also the last issue, the last question is about the discontinuity of supply chain. Very interesting perspective and also subject. And I found very interesting research about the importance of last mile logistics, for example, in last years. And also from a practical and managerial point of view, a great interest from venture capital groups, for example, in startups that invest in last mile logistics. So all the field related to delivery and logistics. So it's just three issues, and I'm interested in your opinion about these three issues. Thank you.
Thank you. The three issues, and they spread over quite a bit of territory. So what I'll just do is I'll try and touch on them very quickly. I have the professorial problem that I could give 9 hours with 10 minutes in between each. But in a nutshell, first of all, internationalization, for being able to integrate and disintegrate I see as a very, very positive thing, because when you're interacting with organizations from a variety of different places, you have to have systems set up that are flexible, and you have to have interfaces that are flexible to with the differences in expectation, in culture, in currency, in a variety of things. So I feel that an international supply chain is much more likely to be able to stay viable and integrate and disintegrate in the appropriate places when necessary. Okay. The next thing is obsolescence. I have another area of research which doesn't really relate to the things that I do here, which is I did a lot of work in the past on sustainable supply chains, and obsolescence and sustainable supply chains is an area where there's often conflict. So I've thought about obsolescence a great deal, and I agree. A lot of firms are very focused on looking at new versions. In some cases, there are questions whether firms have actually created ways of forcing obsolescence, like having little problems that crop up in software over time that naturally slow things down, or ceasing to support earlier models, or changing a product so that it is less remanufacturable over time, moving from screws to clips that break if you try and open and close it. Now, in terms of the continuity of the supply chain, typically when you're looking at new versions, you're looking at a supply chain being more continuous. the product being more continuous, the product more stable. The product has let's call it a trajectory behind it, and it tends to proceed along that trajectory. From the perspective of the end user, whether it's designed obsolescence or it is a vastly new product, what the user is looking for is an experience where they feel that they don't have to change a great deal. I'm not a fan of obsolescence. I'm a fan of trying to extract value and reduce environmental impacts. The third area is the last mile and the interest in modifications to the last mile. And this, actually, if you look at the sustainable supply chains, is a big issue. The last mile is very expensive. It's very complicated going forwards. Even more difficult if you want to try and go backwards, which you're looking at in terms of sustainable supply chains. And a firm that is able to bring in and get out of well, I shouldn't say a firm, a supply chain that can change its downstream, its last mile, is in a much better situation. And we've seen a great deal of difficulty for some very successful older firms associated with this. For example, when we first looked at the internet, people were saying, well, why doesn't the automotive industry do this? You could, pick and click and customize a car. The automotive industry is on a just-in-time basis. This would work very nicely, but they had a system of dealerships, which they had contractual relationships with, so it was impossible. And that opened up an opportunity for other firms, although that particular supply chain hasn't particularly formed itself. Thank you.
Okay, Jonathan, thank you for not taking all the 9 hours you had envisaged. Just to continue discussion among the panelists, I would have a question to Ms. Polyakova, and that is, from what I gather from the results of your surveys, you see hesitation or some skepticism in the Russian workforce or the Russian population taking up robots in the different. Do you think this is a major impediment to the further spread of robots, or at one other point you seem to imply that if there is enough supply and if the people get to know practical experiences in collaborating with robots or using them, this will fade away, the skepticism. Is it a push or a pull factor?
I'm sorry. It is quite problematic question because according to our surveys, Russian population differs quite conservative attitudes to science and technologies in comparison to Europe. And another feature is that people have some strong fear of some risks related to technologies. So I suppose that in future the perception of robots will change in some way, but if we'll compare to probably European attitudes or some other countries, there will be some difference close to current results. Yeah. So people tend to avoid some too risky and strange, not comfortable for them technologies.
Last chance for questions from the floor. Cillo and then Fabienne.
Yeah, I think it's just a follow-up on the perceptions, whether you observed any age difference the views of young people compared to the adult population, whether they're quite homogeneous?
It is quite interesting that if we take the first three types of situation of interaction with robots, there are some age difference. Of course, more young respondents are more tolerant to interaction with robots. But if we consider the last four situations related to the use of robots in medicine, care for elderly people and children in transportation, there is no difference.
Fabienne.
Well, I have one comment and one question. The comment is about the fact that you seem in both Valentina, I don't know if it is linked to the name, but you seem consider that only blue collar will be affected by technology, while the figures today demonstrate exactly the contrary. I mean, you have more white collars in the world that have lost their job than blue collars. So this is something I think you have to take into consideration. The second thing is that it's more to Italian Valentina, is that when you speak skills, and this is a problem with English, is that when you speak about skill, it's a very global thing. If you use two other concepts, I would like to know if you use them, which is aptitude as innate aptitude or abilities, and competencies as acquired competencies. And I would like to know if you, in your studies, in your survey, did you go at this level of detail, and can you tell us something about this, if so?
What I can say to give you, thank you firstly for your suggestion, and with regards soft skills, we since the theoretical framework we adopt based on a resource-based view and a dynamic capability view, we adopt a specific theoretical framework. And we analyze, we adopt items that could capture motivation, indeed, and also level of commitment, and also the micro foundation of soft skills. So the psychologist attitude, as you say, that could improve the soft skills, that could describe the specific set of soft skills, because soft skills is very great constructs. Is a multi-dimensional construct. So we focus just on a specific dimension of soft skills that is related to motivation and commitment, because we analyze that kind of aspect according to a dynamic capability view, because we analyze on the other side the knowledge management capacities of a company. And thank you for your suggestion.
Thank you very much. I think we will not eat further into lunchtime unless you will have not time to eat lunch. I think I call it a day for this session. I thank every one of the presenters and the audience, and I wish you a good lunch. And we reconvene in an hour or so. Thank you.